This is week 2 of the series that is going to take us to Pentecost, entitled Perfectly Imperfect Faith. The great Christian devotional writer Oswald Chambers once said, quote, "Faith never knows where it's being led, but it loves and knows the one who is doing the leading." That's the kind of faith that we are going to encounter in this series as we explore together one of the Bible's great passages on how to live by faith, Hebrews chapter 11. In Hebrews 11, the writer gives us a long list of people in the Old Testament that we can look back at as exemplary in their faith. What we're going to do over the course of this series is talk about the people that often get overlooked. We're not going to talk about Abraham, who makes the list, because Abraham is probably worth a series of his own. We're not going to talk about Moses. We're not going to talk about King David. We're not going to talk about Samuel the prophet. All of these are well-known figures in the Old Testament. We're going to talk about all the minor characters, the people who make the list that you may not even know are in the pages of the Old Testament. Remember, last week in our introduction to this series, we discovered that the writer of Hebrews, when he talks about faith, tends to emphasize these two things. Number one, it involves courage, as opposed to cowardice or shrinking back. And number two, it always includes the notion of being incomplete. That there is something far greater in front of us than we ourselves currently are experiencing. As we explore these minor characters of faith in Hebrews 11, you're going to see both of those things over and over again. So let's start with Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4, which reads, "By faith Abel offered God a better, more acceptable sacrifice than Cain's. Through this offering gift, Abel was approved as just and good in God's sight. He died, but through it he still speaks." This is the first example mentioned of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. And it is the person of Abel, the second generation of human beings discussed in the pages of Scripture itself. And we're going to come back to this verse, but let's go backward to where we learn about Abel in the first place in Genesis chapter 4. And this is a story this morning about Abel, not about Cain. Cain himself, who you will see in this story, is probably worth a sermon of his own. But as I walk you through what we know about Abel in Genesis 4, we're going to put the emphasis on him. So, first two verses of Genesis chapter 4. "Now Adam the man drew near to his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, 'I have produced a man with the help of the Lord.'" If you and I were reading this in ancient Hebrew, you would notice that the name Cain and the verb have produced are built off the same root. The point being that Cain's name is supposed to indicate that he is a treasured possession, something that took work to produce, and now he is valued highly. This you see, by the way, in the last phrase of what I read for you, which is that Eve celebrates that Cain, the firstborn, is from God. He is God's gift to her. Continue reading. "Next she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a tiller of the ground." Abel in Hebrew means this. You know the expression, the refrain in Ecclesiastes? Vanity, vanity, all is vanity. Emptiness, emptiness, all is emptiness. Yeah, that word emptiness is Abel. He's a vapor. He's a mist. He's a nobody. Here, in the second generation of human beings, you have something overtly mentioned that afflicts so many families, both in the Scripture and in our time. It is favoritism. Cain is the beloved gift of God. Abel is the vapor, a nobody. You also, in the telling of this story, will begin to see something you see over and over again in the biblical record, which is God apparently likes the overlooked. David was not the firstborn son of Jesse. Joseph was not the firstborn son of Jacob, and on it goes. Where culture might prioritize the firstborn back in these days, God never did. Continue in the story. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel, for his part, brought the firstlings of his flock, along with the fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. What you have here in the record of Genesis is a presumption of the Mosaic law. Right? Chronologically speaking, we're only one generation after the first human beings. But the only way to understand this text is to read it through the lens of God's law that would be given later through Moses. In fact, Jewish interpreters of this passage always interpret it that way, going back to the time of Jesus and even into the intertestamental period between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So you only understand this if you assume what God gave Moses later. And specifically, what we're talking about here is something you heard Ben read about in Proverbs 3, 9, and 10. You'll also discover it in places like Exodus 22, 28 to 30. It's something called the law of the first fruits. It goes like this. If you were the produce distributor for Kroger, and you were getting together all of your bell peppers that came in through your harvest this year, the first baskets that you get, you're supposed to go through them, and the very best green peppers, not the deformed ones, the oblong ones, the ones that look like the dictionary definition of a green pepper. Those aren't for you, those are for God. This is what we're told in the Old Testament law. This was true about flocks. When you have your first babies of the year, you pick the best ones, the ones that seem like they will grow the most, the first of the litter, and they go to God. They don't stay with you. And so Abel was obeying the law of the first fruits. And of course, Cain was not. One of the most extensive passages about the law of the first fruits is in the prophet Malachi. I'm going to send you a link for the passage tomorrow. I won't read it for you now. It's Malachi chapter 1, verses 6 to 14. And in that, the prophet says that there is always great consequence when you ignore the law of the first fruit in your life. And so Abel does what we know the Mosaic law says to do. Cain does not. He takes a shortcut. He keeps the best for himself. And then we are told God had regard for what Abel brought and not what Cain did. We have no idea how exactly they figured that out. Did a giant thumbs up appear in heaven for Abel's offering and a giant thumbs down for Cain's? We don't know. All we know is that they got the point. And catch the irony. Abel the vapor. Abel, the overlooked second son, was not seen by his mother or valued as highly as Cain. But you know what? God saw him. And God saw what he brought. And then we read in verses 8 and 10 of the story, quote, Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let us go out to the field." And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. And the Lord said, what have you done? Listen to your brother's blood crying out to me from the ground. Please notice, in verse 8, the word brother is repeated twice. The first act of violence in human history is not done to a stranger. It is done to kin. The writer makes sure we don't miss that. It is done in the field, not a field, the field. What field? A field familiar to both of them. Maybe Cain's field, where he reaped his harvest. Maybe Abel's field, where he watched over his flock. This was supposed to be a safe, familiar place, and yet it became a place of violent aggression. And so Cain killed Abel. And then God says to Cain, I hear your brother's blood crying out to me from the ground. That word crying in the Old Testament is almost always only used for the cries of the oppressed, those who have been unjustly afflicted. It's the cries of Israel from Egypt to God when they are enslaved there. It's the cries of widows and orphans and the prophets who scream out for justice. God says to Cain, your brother's voice is filling my ears because of the hateful, unjust thing that you've done. And it is this story that Hebrews points us back to and says, look back to Abel as an example of a radiant faith. Now, sometimes when we encounter lists in the list of names in Hebrews 11, we're going to have to go back to the story and guess at why it gets included. That is not the case here. The author of Hebrews tells us that there are two reasons why he includes Abel in his list of people who are pillars of trust in God. Number one has to do with the offering that he gave. And number two has to do with what it cost him, his death. Let's consider both for a moment. What you see in Abel and hear in his story is first that faith looks like trusting God enough to give him your first and your best. Many of the names you're going to encounter in Hebrews 11 are heroic. They are legendary figures through whom God did extraordinary things. That is not true with Abel. Abel is the everyman of this chapter. Abel's the guy who wonders why he made the list. All Abel did was what was plain and obvious, what God had communicated clearly in the Mosaic Law. Just give me your first fruits. Abel said, I will. That's it. In Abel, what you see is just everyday obedience to what you already know. That's all. And that made Abel the vapor something extraordinary to be emulated. And what he obeyed was the law of the first fruits, giving God your best and your first. What might that look like for you and I to take seriously? Let me ask it to you, or say it to you in the form of 4 questions that you and I could consider. Number 1, will I safeguard having my best available to God and others? Will I safeguard having my best available to God and others? A pastor this week wrote on the well-known Christian blog Patheos about his own reflections on this passage. And what it made this pastor realize is that often in his life, everybody, God, his family, his friends, gets scraps, not the first fruits. Because he lives so busy, so overwrought, trying to accomplish so much that there is no possible way in his life that he could give anybody his best. If you and I were to take the law of the first fruits seriously, we would safeguard having our best available. Malachi, in that passage in the Old Testament that speaks at length about this law, says in verse 10 of chapter 1, it would be better if you guys just shut the gates to the temple and didn't offer anything to God than for you to offer your dregs and your leftovers. Better nothing than that, the prophet says. Number 2, will I give my first and best willingly, even if others overlook and discount me? Because that's Abel, the vapor, the nobody. And yet, dutifully, obediently, he gives God his best, and nobody else may care, maybe not even his mom, but God sure did. And what I would say to you today is, I don't know who you are. I don't know how you've been wronged. I don't know who's pushed you to the margins and when they did it in your life. But your first and your best matter to God if they don't matter to anybody else. Number 3, who am I at my best, and is that what I'm giving God and other people? Oftentimes, we do give other people our attention, our love, our service, but is it out of the best of who we are? What makes you best? What are you most able to do? What do other people say about you that is strongest? How do you affect other people most positively? Is that what you always bring to the table? I had the conversation in the last week with someone in my office where they came in and we were talking about all the things this person is doing at church. And in the flow of that conversation, he said, the thing that I really enjoy the most is this. And I said to him, then we need to make sure that that is what you are always doing here. I don't care about the rest. God just wants your best and your first, and oftentimes we offer him something other than that. What if we became a church family where we paid attention together what was first and best about all of us, and we said, that's what we want you to do, and don't worry about the other stuff. And if something doesn't exist right now where you can execute that first and best, we're going to create it because we value being at your first and your best here. Imagine the possibilities. And last, will I trust God enough to give him and others my best and my first? Because if you give God your best and your first, you have less for you. But I will remind you of what Jesus said in Luke chapter 6, verse 38. Give and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put in your lap. For the measure you give will be the measure you get back. That's the law of the first fruits, but that's only half the story for Abel. The writer of Hebrews 11 could have stopped there and said, Abel should be honored for his obedience to what was plain and known to all. But no, he died for it, the second half of the verse says. There is, of course, an irony here. We remember Abel, the vapor, whose life was cut short, and Cain, who lived much longer, is now notorious. But what you realize here is that Oscar Wilde was right. No good deed goes unpunished. What exactly did Abel do to deserve his death? Oh, that's right. He was just obeying what God had clearly, plainly said. That's all. And yet something in him doing what God had communicated clearly irked his brother enough, threatened his brother enough, that it was met with unexpected, unimaginable rage and violence. This too harkens back to something Jesus said. The last beatitude, Matthew chapter 5, verses 9 and 10. Blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of goodness and justice, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you unfairly on my account. You and I would be wise to remember that our unremarkable obedience can often be met with remarkable resistance. In a world committed to falsehood and pretense, when you tell the truth, you will be met with resistance. In a world committed to quid pro quo, an eye for an eye, when you choose to act in grace, you are going to be met with resistance. When you choose to love all, in a world that chooses to sort people into groups, into tribes, into them and us, you better believe you are going to be met with resistance. When you choose to act in humility, in a world that functions or is driven by pride and pretense, you are going to be met with resistance. This is the lesson of Abel's faith. Just do what you know to do. Do what is plain and right there in front of you, but don't be surprised when out of nowhere you meet a violent reprisal. A stab in the back, a friendship lost, a vocational ladder foregone. This is the lesson of Abel. I want you to know that this verse, Hebrews 11:4, was timely for me this week. On Monday of last week, I got an email from my former presbyter. For those who don't speak Presbyterian, that would be the director of the former district that I was a part of over in Richmond. And he told me, because I was a part of that district's interim pastor group, something that just floored me out of the blue. A friend of mine named Reverend Shannon O'Leary was out walking her dog, and she was the victim of a hit and run in her front yard. And a mother of two, at the young age of 43, died. And as I reflected on writing this sermon about Abel, the vapor, whose name lingers on, though his life was cut short, and that we are to emulate his faith, I sent her husband and her family this short note, and I'd like to end with it today. To Andrew Meyer and family, it was my good fortune to participate in the Presbytery of the James interim pastor group from 2018 to 2020 while serving Culpeper Presbyterian. It was there that I was given the gift of Shannon's friendship. While I loved what most people did about her fiery passion, her willingness to speak up and speak out, her quick wit, her authenticity, what stands out most to me from those meetings is her humility. And that's something others might have missed about her. While wading through some deep, turbulent waters at her church, she was quick to seek others' input and admit when she felt over her head. She'd email me a report or a newsletter piece to read for her, or she'd ask to get together before or after our scheduled meetings on occasion. That desire for outside input speaks to her wisdom far beyond her years. So the Old Testament Proverbs would call to us and say to us, she was wise. I find her willingness to trust and eagerness to lean on others aspirational. She showed me that the most capable are the most collaborative. I treasure the memory of one presbytery meeting when she saw me across the crowded narthex, waved her hands far above her head in the most demonstrative way possible, screamed out my name loudly enough that I was embarrassed, and ran over to give me a hug and ask me how I was doing. All about me, not her. And no pretense whatsoever. That's Shannon to me. As it happens, I'm preaching on Hebrews 11:4 this Sunday, my first sermon after learning of her tragic, untimely death. In the second half of that verse, we read, "He, Abel, died, but through his faith, he still speaks." You see where I'm headed with this, yes? Shannon still speaks, and she will keep on speaking to me, to you, and to so many others whose names we might not know. It is with both deep sympathy and resurrection hope that I write this. Reverend Dr. Christian Scheer. Would you pray with me? Father in heaven, we ask, as we will ask at the end of every sermon in this series, simply to imitate the faith of the one we have heard talked about. May we have unremarkable obedience to the things we already know, and may we be prepared for pushback as we do. No matter who has overlooked us in our life, let us know that you care, that we give you our first and our best. We thank you for the example of Abel. His faith still speaks to us. Amen.